RetroDaze.
When you think about your favorite toy lines from the 1980s, what comes to mind? While answers will vary, there's always a fair amount of crossover. One could argue the same toys come up time and time again because there were only so many releases from 1980 to 1989. But I'd suggest another equally obvious possibility. Well-made and unique toys coupled with aggressive marketing led to huge sales, which helped foster a sense of nostalgia and in turn created enduring popularity.
We can debate this reasoning, but there's no denying that a handful of heavy hitters are always mentioned in conversations of 80s toys, and these are a few of the most prominent. A concept we often return to here at RetroDaze is the 1980s as a golden age of consumerism and toy production. You might remember this was because after decades of restrictions preventing the airing of any programming based on a toy line, in 1983 the FCC reversed many of their decisions from the landmark 1969 ban. By the mid-80s, there existed a seemingly endless stream of cartoons airing on television, each with their very own toy lines, because no longer did the FCC stop cartoons from advertising toys. The floodgates were open, and Mattel was first to rush through with He-Man and the Masters of the Universe.
He-Man, He-Man.
Who's the big guy with the muscles?
He's He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe. Skeletor is his enemy.
He-Man, He-Man.
Here's HeMan, Skeletor, and Castle Grayskull. You have to put the castle together.
You're doomed, He-Man.
Oh yeah? Watch this action, Dad.
He-Man.
Now I have the power.
HeMan and Skeletor each sold separately. Castle Grayskull also sold separately from the Masters of the Universe collection from Mattel.
The first wave of HeMan figures was released in 1982, prior to the creation of the cartoon. These first figures were packaged with illustrated mini-comics drawn by Alfredo Alcala, depicting He-Man as a barbarian from the Eternian tribe. The comics fleshed out a backstory to the toy line, wherein the inhabitants of the planet are living in a post-war civilization which eradicated the higher beings of the world. This war left behind machinery and weapons, some of which He-Man possesses. In this iteration of the story, both He-Man and Skeletor have one half of the Power Sword. If the two halves are combined, it creates the key to Castle Grayskull. That original set consisted of 8 figures, 2 creatures, 2 vehicles, and the Castle Grayskull playset. The figures included heroic warriors He-Man, Man-at-Arms, Stratos, and Teela, and the evil warriors Skeletor, Beastman, and Merman. The creatures were Battle Cat and Screech, and the vehicles were Battle Ram and Wind Raider. The final figure, Zodak, is a bit of a mystery since the character did not appear in any of the mini-comics. The description on his toy card suggests an evil origin, reading, "Zodak attacks the heroic warriors with all the evil power at his command." However, the early DC comics often portrayed Zodak as neutral. Of course, this all predated the release of the cartoon, which only happened after the FCC relaxed its toy-based children's programming ban. In 1982, Michael Halperin wrote the official pitch Bible for the upcoming series, later reworked by Filmation staff writer Tom Ruegger, which invents many of the familiar characteristics of the series. This is the first introduction, for instance, of He-Man's alter ego, Prince Adam. Once the cartoon hit, the already popular toy line flew off the shelves. Wave 2 was released in 1983 with new characters and new waves every year through 1988. Besides the cartoon, comics, and toys, He-Man also saturated nearly every other kid's market with products like Halloween costumes, clothing, bed sheets, dexterity games, party decorations and favors, Viewmaster reels, Shrinky Dinks, wristwatches, and so much more. In addition, the spin-off series in 1985, She-Ra, Princess of Power, invited girls into the franchise to enjoy their own epic battles and fantastic worlds. Even for those of us who didn't have the toys or watch the series, He-Man and She-Ra were so ingrained in the language of our childhood, we were no doubt still affected, be it from attending someone's He-Man themed birthday party, seeing commercials on TV, or hearing friends talk about it while showing off their collections. Another animated series that began its life as a toy line and quickly became one of the best-selling toys of all time is Transformers.
Time Tired of losing battle after battle in the sky, the Autobots create the ultimate robot jet, Jetfire.
Transformers, more than meets the eye.
But the evil Decepticons have a secret new weapon, Shockwave.
The Transformers,
Robots in disguise. Get behind the Yesteryear! Shockwave will stop him!
the Transformers,
From Hasbro.
After attending a toy fair in Tokyo, Hasbro licensed 2 toy lines from Takara Toys. They were Diaclone, which included, you guessed it, cars that transformed into robots, and a Microman line of toys. The molds they purchased included the entire run of 28 figures. Many of the later Transformers also came from pre-existing Takara Toys creations, including figures from Dinobots, Insecticons, Decepticon planes, and the Constructicons. Once the rights and molds were secured, Hasbro executives hired none other than Marvel to create a backstory for the figures. Specifically, the editor Jim Shooter and Dennis O'Neil developed the story, and Bob Budiansky came up with the various names and tech specs for the robots, much of which was then printed on the toy's packaging. 1984's Series 1 of Generation 1 consisted of at least 28 figures, not counting the mail-away promos. Some of the obvious standouts in that first gen were the big boys Optimus Prime and Megatron, mini cassettes like Frenzy and Rumble, the microcassette recorder Soundwave, Decepticon planes like Skywarp and Starscream, and Autobot cars like Mirage and Ironhide. The addition of not only names but a full story and technical specifications for the robots created a vibrant, lived-in universe that kids of the era latched onto. These weren't just a bunch of transforming robots, no, they were the Autobots and Decepticons from the metallic planet Cybertron. While looking for new sources of energy, they crashed on Earth and remained dormant for millions of years before finally awakening in 1984. It's no wonder the toy line so easily lent itself to an incredibly successful animated series, which in turn sold more toys and energized a franchise that is still successful today. Completing what many might consider the big 3 boys' toys of the 80s, we add to our list G.I. Joe.
We'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe.
Cobra's attacking! We're outnumbered! G.I. Joe to the rescue!
The G.I. Joe personnel carrier holds 28 members of the G.I. Joe team.
Let's go! Go get the new members of the G.I. Joe team! Here's Torpedo and Tripwire! Get the Joe team aboard and move them out!
G.I. Joe.
The G.I. Joe personnel carrier holds 28 Joe team members, each sold separately from Hasbro.
In the 50s and early 60s, there were no action figures. There were only dolls. Although these dolls, like Barbie and Ken, were incredibly popular, toy companies were missing out on half the demographic. Enter Stan Weston, who pitched Hasbro a 12-inch military figure for boys. Then CEO Merrill Hasselfeld turned him down cold, but the head of research and development, Don Levine, wasn't so short-sighted. He spent weeks creating prototypes of the designs, and when Hasselfeld saw them, he agreed they were a winner. Of course, no boy was ever going to buy a doll, so Levine coined the term action figure, and in 1964, Government Issue Joe was released to huge success. When the 1973 oil crisis raised the price 70%, Hasbro was forced to cut corners on figure production, which first led to a sales decline and eventually to the cancellation of the toy line. This, as it turned out, was only the beginning. Bob Prupus, Hasbro's senior vice president of international marketing, felt there was still life left in the series and enlisted colleagues Kirk Bazigian, Ron Rudat, Greg Bernstein, and Steve Dogano. They came up with 3 3/4 inch tall figures with 10 points of articulation to outdo Kenner's Star Wars figures, which only had 5. As Hasbro would do with their Transformers line, they approached Marvel Comics, only this time to create a comic series. The FCC, as we know, had strict rules about advertising toys. Specifically, they limited any kind of animation to no more than 7 seconds. Hasbro had considered this and knew the rules weren't as strict for advertising comic books. So once the comics were finished, Hasbro invested $3 million to create a series of 30-second animated commercials for the new Marvel comic book, G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, as reported by Maude Campbell in Popular Mechanics. In the end, Hasbro advertised a comic book series, which in turn advertised a toy line, which would later birth an animated series, which further promoted the toys. That is one heck of a marketing Ouroboros. Boys' toys weren't the only ones that defined the 1980s, and My Little Pony was right up there with some of the best sellers of the decade.
My little pony, my little pony.
I comb and brush her hair.
My little pony, my little pony.
Tie a ribbon to show how much I care.
My little pony, my little pony.
I take her wherever I go.
My little pony, my little pony.
Oh, I love her so. I love you, My Little Pony.
My Little Pony, each sold separately. Collect them all.
But before My Little Pony, there was My Pretty Pony, released in 1981, to lackluster sales. This iteration was much larger at 10 inches tall and came with an interactive gimmick. There was a small lever under the chin to make My Pretty Pony wink, wiggle her ears, and swish her tail. The toy also came bundled with a hat, comb, and blanket for the pony's back, meant to be a low-profile saddle. By 1982, My Pretty Pony was discontinued in favor of a new line of smaller toys based on their predecessor. When Bonnie Zakerla first created My Little Pony, inspired by her love of horses, she envisioned the line as gender-neutral and realistic, marketed for both girls and boys. It was the marketing director at Hasbro that suggested designing the toys in colors like pink and purple, a suggestion which Zakerla initially dismissed, but when test groups for the toys proved the idea a solid one, they moved ahead with My Little Pony. This change also equated to one of the first toy lines for girls that wasn't created with societal norms in mind. According to Shannon McGuire in her Polygon article, the brightly colored, chunky equines were for fantasy-loving little girls who didn't want to learn to be better mommies as much as they wanted to learn how to fight monsters and go on epic quests. My Little Pony paved the way for fantasy and adventure to begin occupying space on the pink side of the toy aisle. As McGuire points out, only after the success of My Little Pony did we see the likes of Rainbow Bright, the Care Bears, the Gummy Bears, and all the great pink-washed fantasy franchises of the early 1980s. That's one heck of a legacy. While all the toys on today's list were incredibly popular, Cabbage Patch Kids was the first to set off a frantic holiday season buying frenzy, which resulted in vicious fights among buyers, an illegal market for sales, and plenty of disappointed children on Christmas morning.
Good parents make Cabbage Patch Kids.
The Cabbage Patch Kids. Each doll is different, and you can pretend to adopt them.
My baby has a real diaper.
You can love and care for them, like your very own.
You're a pal. You're the only one. I love you.
They're each one of a kind. They're Cabbage Patch Kids. You can give them all your love.
Cabbage Patch Kids are each sold separately. Each doll comes with a pretend birth certificate and adoption papers from Coleco.
The original story of Cabbage Patch Kids' creation claimed that Xavier Roberts started making these dolls and selling them, along with their birth certificate and adoption papers, at craft fairs. Eventually, the dolls became so popular, Roberts could no longer keep up with demand and signed a deal with Coleco to take over manufacturing. While all of this is true, it leaves out the bit at the very beginning where Roberts stole the design from folk artist Martha Nelson Thomas after she refused to continue letting Roberts sell her dolls in his gift shop. Thomas later sued, and Roberts settled out of court for an undisclosed amount in 1985. Of course, in the 80s, all we knew was that these dolls, marketed as being unique and adoptable, each with their own first and middle name, were prized gifts for the holiday season and often impossible to come by. Coleco even canceled all advertising at one point as they struggled to keep up with demand. Unlike all the other toy lines on today's list, Cabbage Patch Kids never did have an animated series, though they did have a few specials, starting with The Cabbage Patch Kids First Christmas, which premiered on ABC in 1984. Other merchandising included an album, book series, video game, clothing line, and more, which resulted in a children's merchandising sales record of $2 billion in 1984.
To further illustrate the enduring legacy of these 1980s toy lines, every one of them are still active, be it through new toys, comics, animated series, or something else. With such a broad and diverse landscape of toys in the 1980s, there were plenty of other series we could have discussed, and I'm sure you may have been screaming at the screen as we skipped over one of your favorites. So tell us, which other toy lines defined the 80s? I would love to hear about it down in the comments. And if you enjoy our content, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and maybe even activating that ubiquitous notification bell. It really does make a huge difference. Let's meet again next week to celebrate yesteryear, right here on RetroDaze.
Clicky clacky.